Hey everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Physiotutors Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Darren Burgess, currently the head performance manager at Melbourne FC, and prior to that it was also at Arsenal and Liverpool. Darren is a lecturer, an educator, researcher, and as I just found out, also a podcaster. Look, that's enough from myself. Why don't you take a couple of minutes, introduce yourself to our audience, and then we'll dive on into our topic of today, elite sports performance and load management.
Cheers, Sonny. Thanks for having me on, mate. It's a fantastic podcast, and hopefully I can sort of add some sort of value to it. I guess my brief history, I was never good enough to play, so I thought the best way to get involved in sport would be to help others perform. I know a lot of podcasters sort of say, well, it was a promising career. I was working up through the ranks in whatever academy, and then I got injured and fell in love with sports. But no, it's not that at all. It's very much never good enough. So, but I love sport. Typical Aussie male. Played all the sports growing up, and so studied sports science. Went on to do a PhD. It was sort of 8 years to do a 3-year PhD because I was working at the time. Working jobs ranging from in football with the Australian national team for 4 years, which included the World Cup in South Africa, which was absolute highlight. Taking an Aussie team through the Asian qualifying, which was playing in everywhere from Dubai to Bahrain in 45-degree heat, and taking these guys straight from Europe into that environment. So that was a good experience. Liverpool for 3 years and Arsenal for 2 years. Arsenal, slightly different role, less hands-on and more sort of overseeing and management. And in Australian rules football, Aussie rules, I've had a couple of stints with a club called Port Adelaide as a high performance manager, and now working for Melbourne Demons in my second year as high performance manager. So yeah, that's the career, I guess.
Oh, nice. I appreciate the honesty there at the beginning with regards to sport and talent. It's always refreshing.
Yes, absolutely. I know my limitations.
Always important. So there's no bets of you trying to bet with the players if you're going to outspeed them on the sprints.
No, never. Learned that very early.
Fair play. Obviously, when it comes to working in elite sports with athletes, there's a ton that you're going to have to factor in. And you've been at multiple clubs, you've been at multiple levels, elite Olympic level, elite Premier League football. And it's not possible for someone to just walk into a club and be like, right, this is my way of doing things. I'm going to stamp down my authority and I'm just going to do my thing. You do this on this day, and that's it. There's no questions asked. What's your first step when you join a new club, join a new team, and what's the first thing you do with regards to assessing the state of affairs as they are when you arrive, and what you can sprinkle, what you can add to the ingredients there to try to spice things up a bit, shall we say?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Sonny. I'll give you the example at Liverpool. I came in, was hired by Rafa Benitez and his sort of team, but he got sacked before I got there. But I was arriving with a couple of other Aussies, which helped because we sort of came as a bit of a team. But Rafa cleared out the decks, and so there was, I think there was 18 Spanish staff that left with him, and so we had no one, literally nothing. Not a fitness coach, not a piece of data, nothing. So in some ways that was a good thing because we could start again and we could bring in some great people at Liverpool, John Moore's uni, like Barry Just and those guys, to provide us with some students and give us some local context. So that was a good part about it. What we learned quickly is that, and what we knew is that Liverpool's a successful club. They had very successful players. What am I going to tell? How am I going to improve Steven Gerrard or Fernando Torres or Pepe Reina? Or how am I, the Spaniards won the World Cup, so those guys came back as World Cup winners. So
yeah.
If you went in with that attitude, you'd soon be found out. So my philosophy was to have a look at how they did things, most of it was in Spanish, the record. So I had to sort of get Google Translate, which wasn't as good as what it is now.
As good as it is now, yeah.
Yeah, this is back in 2010. So we had to, I took the process of interviewing every player, what works for you, what doesn't work for you, what didn't work in the previous regime. I'm sure we made some mistakes, but my philosophy was try and earn the players' respect first. So don't rock the boat too much. If there was some low-hanging fruit or glaring things that they were doing incorrectly, then work on that, but earn their respect first, get their trust, and then start to implement little things that I believed should be done. I think with all players, once they know that you're in it for them and not for you, then they'll tend to listen a little bit more.
And then once you've gone through the process of talking to them and finding out what their normal style is for them personally, and two, what the ethos is of the club when it comes to performance management or what have you, what is your strategy for assessing the players as they are there and then in terms of fitness and in terms of what attributes that you guys can work on together?
Yeah, it's a tough one. In a sport like football, skill is going to dominate over fitness all day. Across the season, fitness and resilience comes into it, but skill is going to dominate. So in a 5-week preseason, it's probably not prudent to spend a lot of time assessing their fitness capabilities. So with that in mind, when I started working with the Australian national team, I had a Dutch coach who was an incredible coach, Pim Verbeek, but he was very much of the Dutch philosophy of everything's with the ball and everything's. So we developed a sub-max fitness test, which took 7 minutes, 4 minutes of work, 3 minutes of recovery. And I just used it as part of a warm-up, and that really helped when players are coming from all around the world, which Australian players play. It was a really quick way of assessing their fitness. So it's essentially, everyone does the same amount of work, and you have a look at how quickly their heart rate comes down when they're standing still at the end of that 4 minutes of work. It's sub-max. It's pretty easy to do. So we did that, certainly at Liverpool, certainly at Arsenal. And because I'd had a bank of data over the years, the test has been validated and published. That certainly helped. The physio screening, that the excellent physios that I've worked with to have a look at musculoskeletally, where the players were at, certainly was part of that testing battery. You rely on staff that had worked there before. We had some physios and doctors both at Liverpool and Arsenal, for instance, that had been there for a while. So you rely on their IP as well. You know, this player's tendency is to do this. This player is a chronic reporter. This player doesn't report anything, you know, those sorts of things. So it's a combination of things, but I think some assessment's important, but I certainly wouldn't be wasting a full day of pre-season just on testing players. If you can come up with something, and there's a few good sub-max tests around that are a part of your warm-up, then I think that helps.
All right. I think one of the things you mentioned there about players under or over reporting, something interesting for us to touch on later. But maybe first, can you name a couple of submax tests that people might be able to take away?
Yeah, certainly the one that we use, which is the submax yo-yo, it's 4 minutes of the yo-yo IR2, and then it's 2 or 3 minutes of recovery. I started off with 3 minutes, players just standing still, but when it was validated by an excellent sports scientist by the name of Chris Verglers, who did his PhD on it, so it's published, so you can find that. He found that only 2 minutes recovery was needed. You didn't need 3 minutes recovery. So we've now been using 2 minutes, so that took off a minute of the test. Martin Bouchard developed the 30-15 intermittent submax test, which is published and well validated in the literature. So yeah, those two are probably, I'm obviously going to have a bias towards my one, but Martin's is very good, and yeah, no issue at all. It's great because you can do a whole team at once, and literally it's over in 6 minutes. So, and Martin's doesn't take much longer than that either. And it's very well documented. A lot of teams around the world use Martin's.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely something that I've noticed as well. If you can do something with the whole team in one go, it's going to save you a lot of time rather than going one by one with the fellas and being like, okay, now we're going to do this, now we're going to do this, and then repeating yourself 20 plus times for the entire squad. Yeah.
Yeah, look, it doesn't have to be one that's out there. You can develop your own. We're not doing this to publish. We're doing this to what we think is a way to assess your players. So I've had really, really good performance staff in the past. You do bike tests, and it might be just 4 minutes riding on a bike at a certain wattage, and you get off and rest and see how quickly the heart rate comes down. So there's a whole range of different ones that you can do, but I like them because I do like heart rate based tests, because heart rate doesn't lie, players do. It's a really good way to assess how players are coping with your program, coping with your rehab program, and can be a return to play criteria as well.
So do you utilize any self-reported RPEs at all with your players?
Yep. No, we certainly do that. So players report RP at the end of every session, as well as wellness scores in the morning, 3 mornings a week. So That's part of our assessment criteria. Look, there's been limited. The research on RPEs is very good. I have less confidence in it than others in my field, and that's fine. There's very successful people who utilize RPE a lot. I think it's not bad, but I do think that the way you collect it, the education of your group, the enthusiasm of your group to report accurately, all those things have to come into play before you can consider it accurate.
Yeah, I suppose you have to combine it with those sort of external load measures like the heart rate stuff, and not
Absolutely.
just
Yeah. I believe if you can, then that will give you a more complete picture.
Yeah. All right. So then, once you're done assessing, you've got your data for your players. What's then your main principles for the training that you're going to start implementing with them?
Yeah, so if you talk about a Premier League pre-season where there's 5 weeks, and I was lucky enough to work with a couple of reasonable, big clubs. So you're off to America, to Australia, to Asia for pre-season. So the chance to improve any physical parameters is very limited. So the way in which we went about it, and I would recommend, is what are the big rocks? And when I got into Arsenal, we assessed their hamstring fascicle length and hamstring strength because that was the number one injury in the Premier League, really. So we made sure that we included eccentric strength with their hamstring, and we also made sure that we included gradual but repeated speed exposure in order to protect the muscle from injury, and that's total muscle, not just hamstring. So they were the 2 big rocks that we put in there. At Liverpool, we implemented a really good gym culture with the help of some excellent staff there. Jordan Milsom, we employed there, who's now up at Rangers and doing great things with Stephen Gerrard, helped implement a really good strength culture, lifting culture there, and with the help of the physios there and the doctors, Phil Coles, Andrew Neal, and Rob Price, Chris Morgan, we used a really good pre-training sort of individual needs. Okay, this player needs a little bit of proprioception, this player needs a little bit of, and so they all went into the gym pre-training. So it might only be for 15 minutes, but it allowed them a sort of a specific area to work on. So once you have that assessment, it's no point if you don't actually work on it. But there are many, in AFL, we don't have those constraints. We have a 16-week pre-season, so there's plenty of time to work on players' individual needs. In the Premier League, you just don't. So you have to just pick out little things here and there that you can work with. And there's some strategies to get that done well. No doubt I've done some things poorly and hopefully other things well. So, but I think if you can come up with 2 or 3 big rocks and focus on those, then I think that's important.
If you're implementing these sort of larger aspects in the preseason, how are you doing, or what is the carryover in the season? And then how often are you guys going to be training in season? Obviously, with different sports, you've got a different amount of games. So if you look at, if we take football, you can have 3 games in a week sometimes, or 2 games in a week. Or if you look at baseball, someone might have 6 games in a week or more at times.
Yep.
How do you manage then their training schedule in terms of sort of S&C work compared to training for sports specific stuff and then game time?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there are a whole bunch of different ways to do this. So I have to say at the outset that I don't pretend that this is the way to do it, but the way we implemented or tried to implement from an S&C point of view. So let's take again repeated eccentric exposure to the hamstrings as an example. If we played Thursday night, Thursday night, because unfortunately with Arsenal and with Liverpool, I was in the Europa League and not the Champions League, and so it was Thursday to Sunday, it was we would often give the guys a 10-minute hit of eccentric exposure, so some Nordics, some rear foot elevated split squats or single leg lunges in the dressing room after a game. So they would come in, they do 10 minutes of activity after a game, and that was mixed success. I would say overall it was a success, but there are of course players who either didn't do it or didn't do it properly. And as we know with some of these exercises, unless you're doing it to max, you're not really being as effective as you otherwise could be. So But overall, I would say it was a success. You can imagine you lose at Tottenham, local rivals, and then you're coming in and you're wanting players who are internationals who have people pander to them all the time, and you're wanting them to do 2 sets of 4 Nordics, in the middle of a dressing room, or you're in Romania in Europa League in the early stages. It's Thursday night. Players are annoyed that they're in the Europa League squad, not the Premier League squad, and they know they're probably not going to play on Sunday, but that's the only chance you have of getting them an exposure. It's not always successful, but overall, I think we did it pretty well. It was amazing how the staff would leave the room when it was time to tell the players that they've got some Nordics or some lunges to go. I look around and go, right, who's going to do it? Okay, I guess it's me. So it was, that was always interesting. But as far as the conditioning goes, that's a tougher one as well, because you have players who are on the bench who need to go out after games and do a bit extra. Some people will do it the next day. When you're going Thursday, Sunday, it's pretty hard to do it the next day. So we would, depending on the schedule and what the player's most recent exposure was, and we had some really good information around their previous 7, 14, 28, 21, 28 day exposure. Some players would go out, some players wouldn't. And again, that was a pretty hard thing to do. It's snowing, it's January, it's -3 degrees, and you've got, again, internationals taking them out after games to do a bit of extra running. But we did it, and it was almost always done well. You'd hopefully sold it to players, the importance of doing it. So that's the way we sort of treated both. In season, it was, you would just look at the calendar ahead of schedule and say, right, we can do a gym exposure there, we can do a gym exposure there, we can get a speed exposure there, and that would be part of a elongated warm-up. We want all players to hit maximum speed today, and we'd have the live GPS there, right? Who hasn't got it? Sonny, you haven't got it, you have to give us another one. Whereas so-and-so, you've got it. Okay, you're done. Go into the rondos or whatever the warm-up activity was.
Okay, that was going to be the sort of next question. You mentioned as well the gradual repeated speed. How are you guys measuring that? And assuming now with GPS, what is it that you're doing with that? If you can run us through that.
It's I often have debates with practitioners. Oh, well, GPS isn't accurate for measuring speed, and you should have timing gates and things like that, and possibly. But we're assessing their speed in games and in training using GPS, so it's important to use the same tool always. So we would sit there with live GPS, take them through as I said before, a more athletic-based warm-up, a less football-specific and more athletic warm-up. Build them into a speed exposure and make sure they hit generally 90% of their speed. What are we doing with that? We believe that, or I believe that the more you can expose people to maximum speed, the more resilient and robust they get when they're required to do it in a game. There's 2 aspects to it. There's both the maximum speed, and then there's a volume of sprint speed that you need to expose players to. That's the trickier one. The maximum speed, you can generally, if a player doesn't get it in warm-up, you can generally say to a player, listen, at some point in the training session, I need you, Sonny, to get your 90% max because you didn't get it in the warm-up. Okay, otherwise, after the session, we'll do a couple of sprints. That's pretty easy. It's the volume, I think, that's also important. If you have a player that regularly gets, let's say, 400 meters of sprint running in a game, and because of tactical, positional, fatigue, whatever, they've been 2 or 3 weeks without getting that, then you need to make sure that they hit that, because it may well be in one game coming up when they haven't had 3 weeks of exposure to that volume that they're asked to do it because of tactical whatever. So that's where it becomes important to keep an eye on what they're getting, both in games and at training, and top up where necessary. There's no great formula for it, but if you're playing, I don't know, Saturday to Saturday, then a Wednesday, Thursday is pretty safe. If you're playing Sunday to Thursday, you're sort of holding your breath. Occasionally a Tuesday, you might be able to inch up the player to make sure their chronic load remains high. And it is just a case for me of saying, right, we need 200 meter sprint from you today. If you don't get it at training, we might do 2 or 3 sprints at the end. And most of the time I'll try and incorporate a ball in that, but with some players they're like, nah, just let me run, I want to go in.
Yeah.
So so it just depends on the player and the circumstance.
Okay, and I'm assuming that the sprint work in terms of reaching your 90% and the volume is for injury prevention,
Yes,
more so to keep the players ticking over, so that there's no
absolutely.
sudden exposure. And
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah. I use the theory of, Sonny, if you call me up and say, I'm moving house, I need you to help me lift some boxes, I'm going to be pretty sore for a few days because it's something that I haven't done in a while. But if I keep doing it every week, we keep doing it, I'm going to get less and less sore. And so you just don't want to shock the body at all times. If you can help it, do not surprise the body, because it'll let you down.
okay. And I suppose also that's a bit of the thinking that goes into the Nordics as well, post game, in
Yeah.
terms of injury prevention kind of thing after.
Yeah, we could spend a whole nother podcast on whether Nordics are appropriate or not, and the benefits. There's so much evidence; it's almost overwhelming, and you're almost being negligent if you don't include them or some part of eccentric exposure. So whatever your poison is, I wouldn't be brave enough to suggest what people must do, but whatever your eccentric exposure is in the gym, we are doing that for protection. Because at that level, at say the Premier League level, and not just Premier League level, but the main thing is to keep your players on the park. You'd rather have a slightly less fit individual that's resilient than a super fit individual that breaks down all the time.
Yeah, you don't want that high
No,
performance sports car that's going to break at the first sign of a speed bump.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
And then how is it that you're then incorporating the sports specific work into what you're doing?
Yeah, so for example, if in your periodization plan you're saying, okay, today is 800 meters high speed and a 7 kilometer session and 150 meters of sprint, if that's what you think the session today is best for your team. In football, there's 2 ways that you can make it sport specific. If you have a manager that enables you to maybe adjust a drill here and there, then you can, if the manager wants to play 5v5, you can make the pitch size bigger, you can reduce player numbers, you can add a cone or a pole 40 meters away from the game, and every 2 minutes everybody's got a sprint around the pole. There are numerous ways in which you can make it really specific in drill alteration, and that's something that I've done a lot of over the years, and I think that's perhaps the more effective way of doing it. If you have in the early time at Arsenal under Unai Emery, his English wasn't particularly great, so he often took a long while to explain drills and what he wanted in between drills and things like that. Obviously, it improved as his English got better, but then at the training sessions would drag on a long period of time. So then we would look to do as specific sprint exposure as possible, or high speed exposure. So the midfields, the forwards, defence, wide players would get in small groups, and we would take them through a conditioning protocol, which might take a lot less, might only be 7 or 8 minutes of work, but it was really specific work to recovery to that position. So I guess there's 2 ways in which you can be specific within the drills themselves, or within your conditioning block at the end, or at
Okay,
the start, whenever you feel that appropriate.
nice. And then let's say if you do get a player that's sort of returning to play, what are the sort of measures that you're going to take before you're happy as, yeah, they're also going to be with the physio, and if you're working in high performance sports, then you guys are going to be having quite a close relationship.
Sure.
What are your sort of measures that you're using before you let people go back, or the things that you want to look at and try to tick off as you're sort of getting them back on the field to play?
Generally speaking, again, it depends on the injury, but if we take a hamstring injury again, because that seems to be the theme of the day, if we do that, I would want their strength assessed however you want to assess their strength, but let's say it's a Nord board, to be within A, 90% of their max, and B, within about normally about 85% of symmetrical left to right. And then they would have need to have been exposed to 90% speed. And if it's a grade 1 sort of 10 to 14 day, it's a little bit harder to make sure that they clear 2 or 3 training sessions. But if it's a 2 or 3 weeker, then you would want them to have trained with the squad for 2 or 3 days, 2 or 3 full sessions before coming into a game. So the criteria would be strength, speed, exposure, X-cells and D-cells, and they're pretty hard to assess. I did my PhD on GPS, so that's my bias, but I'm well aware of the limitations of X-cells and D-cell assessment using GPS. So you can do that both objectively as well as visually, making sure that the player has been exposed to a lot of change of direction load as well.
Okay, nice. And then how is it you're going to go about assessing something like neuromuscular fatigue for your players, not just for those who are returning from injury, but those who are still on the field, still have been playing and whatnot? What is it you're doing there?
You're really getting me to talk controversially and to piss a whole lot of people off, Sonny, by giving my opinions on these
You're welcome.
sort of topics. Yeah, Nordics and return to play and everything. So neuromuscular fatigue, I have used reaction time tests. I have used, lights and pressing buttons, and I've used a whole range of different tests, force plate tests. So that's probably what I've used most of is a counter movement jump to have a look at neuromuscular fatigue. Is it perfect? Probably not at the moment. That's what we do at the Melbourne Demons, is we use a force plate and look at counter movement jump. You're relying on player motivation. You're relying on the fact that is a counter movement jump assessing neuromuscular fatigue. We don't really know. But that's what we use is counter movement jump. I also look at heart rate variability. I'm a big fan of that, which looks at sort of all cause stress, of which neuromuscular would be a part of that. So yeah, there's a few things to look at, but mainly counter movement jump.
Nice. And then are you guys factoring in a sort of internal and external load management within all of that as well?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this, Sonny. I went away from heart rate for probably 10 years because I just thought, it's too easy, and GPS is sexier, and
It's the new shiny thing.
Yeah, it is very much so. And I think Aussie sports scientists are to blame for a lot of reliance on GPS, if I'm honest. But I don't think there's any value in looking at just external without internal and just internal without external. So I think you need a balance of both. And for me, it's heart rate, some sort of heart rate metric, whatever you think is appropriate, whether it's average or percentage of time above 80%, whatever it might be, and some sort of external load. So we graph our players every day on what did they put out and what was the cost, and that's by GPS metric versus a heart rate metric, and yeah, that's what we look at.
Okay, nice. Gives you a good little overview of that as well. Then, what would you say?
It doesn't. It allows you to track players over time. Are they becoming more and more less disturbed by your training sessions? So are they becoming fitter? Hopefully.
What would you say would be then the top 2 or 3 things for anyone working in elite sport, be they physio, be they on high performance strength and conditioning, to put into their practice, be it a concept or a principle or training style, method, what have you?
Let me see. I would say the top 2 things are understand your player So get to know your player, and that sounds, everybody's saying that at the moment, so it sounds a little bit airy-fairy. But what I do know is that when players are unhappy or stressed, they are far more likely to be injured. And I've worked with some really good sports psychologists and psychiatrists who've been able to point that out to me, because I was a bit naive. No, just train them all. But if players are going through contract negotiations or family issues, they are far more likely to get injured. So get to know your players, or have some of your staff know the players quite well. And secondly is, don't be afraid of chronic load. I think our jobs are to make the players as resilient and robust as possible. And so once you get up to chronic load, to high chronic load, and you've got players who can regularly play Wednesday, Saturday in football, if there's a week off in between, so, if there's a Saturday to Saturday after doing 4 straight Saturday, Wednesday, Saturdays, don't be tempted to recover them. Just keep them at that high chronic load, because I think it's more the changing week to week than the high load that will cause both performance decrements and injury risk. And there's just too much information for me, anecdotal data and data that I've collected over many years of doing this, as you can see by my grey hair and wrinkles, that show that players love a rhythm of exposure. So don't take that from them.
You mentioned there working with sports psychologists and whatnot. What other disciplines do you find yourself crossing over with to ensure that you can get the best for the players that you're working?
Yeah, I guess I've been lucky enough that since 2005, I've been in head fitness coach or high performance, whatever your title is. So I've had to manage different staff, all related to performance. So sports psychology is something that has I've only leaned on heavily in the last 5 years, which is to my detriment. I should have done it a lot earlier. So certainly psychology, as well as I guess statisticians are coming a lot more on vogue and easier to use now. So I think that's really important, because you need to make sure that your data is robust. If you're going to make decisions on the data, you need to make sure they're robust and well executed, I guess. So I've used Kairos in the past. Good practitioner is a good practitioner regardless of your discipline. My head of rehab at the moment is an osteo, and he just adds a different dimension to assessment and retraining. So yeah, there's a few different, I guess, disciplines. We've used biomechanists, people to assess running gait, those sorts of things when players have repeatedly broken down. So I'm pretty open, far more open than I was as a young guy who thought I knew it all. So yeah, it's if someone's, I once got told that all knowledge is personal knowledge. So I'll listen. Okay, this is not for us. This is for us. Okay, let's try it. So yeah, I'm not there's no one discipline that's got all the answers.
No, absolutely. Can you share with us some potential learning moments that you've had working, be it with an athlete or be it with the coaches or with other members of staff, students, what have you?
Yeah. Oh, look, there's been a lot, honestly. I'll give you one with coaches. I think it's really, as a general rule, we performance staff, so physios, doctors, fitness coach, we often think, the coach has gone crazy. What's he doing? Why would he pick him? Why would he train him harder? Why would he do this? A coach that I worked with quite recently, a very successful coach, when we had sort of 4 games in 9-10 days, I went to him with a plan and said, here is, based on all the conversations with the doctor, the sports scientists, the physios, and said, okay, these are the changes that I think, because this player can't handle 4 games in 10 days, this player can, all that. And he looked at it and said, look, I appreciate the effort that you went into for this, and the data is outstanding, because I'd gone back 5 years. This player 5 years ago couldn't handle this game load, broke down, that sort of stuff. And he said, look, in my experience, let's take each game as it comes, because we could win the first 4 and the 5th isn't as important. You've got this particular player playing the first 3 games. He could get a red card in the first game. And then your whole plan is, let's back our management skills and I will back your knowledge to make decisions on the run, rather than plan all these 3 or 4 games in a row, because anything can happen in that time. He said, I could be sacked in 2 games. And for me, that was a really important. I went back to my staff, and of which there was 16, 17, and said, all right, okay, the plan didn't quite get across the line. And they were like, no, this is crap. We're going to break down. We're going to lose games. No wonder. No. I completely understand that. Let's take each game as it comes and back your management skills. Let's have a skeleton plan to say, if all goes well, then Sonny, you probably shouldn't play that 3rd game because blah, blah, blah. So certainly don't disrespect the coaches. They're coaches for a reason, and they get paid a lot more than us for a reason, because they're highly skilled, highly talented people with a lot of experience. So I think it's really easy for us to sort of put the blame on coaches when they don't follow a scientific plan. Football's been going okay before we became involved, and it'll go okay after we became involved, after we leave. So in terms of staff, one of the big learnings was the impact of psychology on performance. That has been a huge learning for me, and I've dismissed that a lot in the past. So as I said, the last 4 or 5 years, that's really come to the fore for me. One of the other things that I learned is that rhythm of exposure. In 2014, I was part of a team that was quite successful in the AFL. We made the conference playoffs. So any NFL fans were in the game that's coming up this week, the chance to make the Super Bowl, with a team that was predicted to come down the bottom. We had a really good season, and then we recruited really well. So the next season it was, okay, Port Adelaide are going to win. And the first 5 or 6 games were really tough games. So I reduced the training load in between those games, because they were local derbies. They were traveling to Perth. They were, the GPS showed that they were really high physical load games. And I think that was to the team's detriment, because later on in the season, we didn't perform as well, because I didn't carry out the belief of that rhythm of high exposure is a good thing. So that was a lesson learned for me, that we should have trained harder in those midweek or sort of Tuesday, Wednesday training sessions. That was borne out by data and player feedback and coach feedback. So it's certainly been a bunch of learning experiences. I used to physically have to be restrained almost from not doing Nordics, because they weren't specific. They didn't look like anything to do with football. I used to have full-on arguments with physios at Liverpool. Why would you do them? And they're like, why would you not do them? And so I didn't do them just because I was stubborn and thought I knew everything. But now I insist on them, because how could you not do them with the data that's available? You're negligent to your athletes if you don't do them. So there's been a few. I could go on for another hour and a half, I reckon, Sonny, about more things that I've learned. So
grand. We'll wrap it up with the last 2 points. The last proper last one will be, where can people find you? But firstly, you mentioned yourself that you have a podcast, and it's something that I think quite interesting. First, if you can tell us, maybe briefly summarize what it is that you do on the podcast. And 2, one of the things you mentioned is having the difficult conversations. What, in your experience now, you've got some times around the sun under your belt of doing that and having these conversations. For you, is your approach when having that difficult conversation of, look, this player shouldn't go on, obviously you can't tell the coach no, but you strongly word.
So the podcast is the Brookie and Burjo podcast. Dr. Peter Bruckner, very famous sports medicine physician of clinical sports medicine fame, Bruckner and Kahn, which is kind of the Bible for most physical therapists around the world. So what we wanted to do is have a different sort of podcast where we talk about mistakes that we've both made. Brookie's worked with Liverpool, Australian soccer team, Australian cricket team, Olympics, everything. Mistakes that we've made and how we learnt them and what we did to remedy them. So in each of our own careers, but also we're speaking to coaches. We've had Justin Langer from the Australian cricket team. We've had Joe Montemiro from the Arsenal women's team. We've had Cody Royal, who's a successful coach educator as well as a coach himself. Talk to coaches as well as performance staff about how they navigate those difficult conversations. So difficult conversations with staff, doctor saying this player shouldn't play. I might say this player should play. How do you come to resolution there? Saying to a coach, this player is not going to play. The coach saying, no, but I think he's going to play. And the player has told me that he can play. How do you navigate those situations? So we just thought we'd work on, I guess, the softer skills. My philosophy has been, has probably changed a little bit. I'm pretty blunt. I'm pretty straight down the line. I'll be as honest as possible. It's got me into trouble in the past because I've had staff that haven't been as honest as they could be with me, and staff that have said to players, look, Burjo wants you to play. I don't want you to play, but Burjo wants you to play. And that just never goes well. And
murky waters.
Yeah. So my philosophy is be as honest as you possibly can. What coaches and some performance staff don't respect is the player bullshit meter. I don't know why. I don't know why they think that players won't understand, or that players can't see through the fact that you're lying, or you're just trying to be their mate to get a watch at the end of the season, or those sorts of things. Like, I just don't understand why people would rather be friends with a player than have a tough conversation with them about where they're at physically, mentally, their ability to perform. So I've probably missed out on a whole lot of watches from players at the end of seasons, but I'd rather be as honest as possible to coach. I had a coach tell me, a couple of stories around that, just to finish with. A coach told me after he left a club, very successful coach, listen, if I had have taken on board some of your suggestions, not listened to because you knew everything, none of that. If I'd have taken on board some of your suggestions, we would have won a lot more trophies in the last 10 years than what we did, because I listened to the wrong people, and the players weren't resilient enough. And then had another coach say to me, took me out to dinner after I left the club and said, do you know, in the years that we worked together, the best thing that you ever said to me, and I went, shit, what's this going to be? And he, because I wasn't afraid to be honest to him, and most of the time he was surrounded by people who just said yes sir, no sir, whatever they wanted. He said, one time you told me that a player shouldn't play. I said, in my experience, I've been doing this for 15 years and players, and my reply to him was, no, you've been a player for 10 years, a coach for 5 years. This is all I've done because I was never good enough to be a player. In my experience at 25 years of doing this, or 23 at the time, I think it was, I don't think this player should play, but I respect your decision because you're the boss. But I'm telling you, in 23 years, this player is a high risk of being injured. And he said, I was too stubborn at the time, and fair play to him. He said, I was too stubborn at the time. I was never going to concede to you. But that point that you made was really honest, and I changed my opinion of you after that, after you stood up to me. I went, no, okay. Anyway, so it can get you in trouble, but I would rather, I'd rather be that way than false.
Fair enough. I like that. I like that approach. And look, just to wrap up, where can people find you, or some of the research that you've done, or some of the work that you're doing?
Generally on Twitter, at Darren Burgess 25, or look, I'm really open to having discussions with people about this. So LinkedIn, ResearchGate, or my email is darrenburgess25@hotmail.com. Just send me an email and let's chat all things performance, because I quite love having the discussion, the debate.
Love it. Nice. Hey, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and
Cheers, Sonny.
enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the season for you, and the weather.
No worries.
See ya.
Thanks, mate. 30 degrees today. Thanks, mate.
Thanks. Bye. Well, ladies and gents, thanks again for listening in, and we'll catch you next time. As always, wherever you're listening to this, we appreciate your time, and if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to get in contact and let us know. Until next time, peace.